know how evil these people are. I could just see him compelling. They said to me, make us gods who will lead us. We don't know what happened to this fellow Moses who brought us here from the land of Egypt. We don't know who that guy is. So Aaron says, I told them, I guess whoever has gold jewelry, take it off. And when they brought it to me, I simply threw it into the fire, and out came this calf. We've all had siblings say ridiculous things, and this is one of the most ridiculous of all. I just threw it in there, and out came this calf. I don't even know what happened. A couple of weeks ago, Aaron was a huge hero. Today, he's a half-wit, making excuses like a 7-year-old. Obviously, Moses is enraged about all the stuff that's going on, so he does some pretty extreme things, the things that we just mentioned a moment ago in the text. But he does it to do something important, to make an unmistakable and unforgettable point about how bogus, how sinful, how way off track what Aaron and the people do. It just doesn't make any sense. But what we did not take a look at last Sunday, because we pretty much know this part of the story if you were a part of last week, what we did not take a look at last Sunday was why Moses responded with such an intensity and being so upset and gave a zero effort to measure his response. He doesn't do it with caution. He doesn't hem and haw. He doesn't think. He decides to melt the thing down, ground it up, and put the flakes in the water and make everybody drink the water with the gold in it. This is his reaction. There was a conversation, you see, on the top of the mountain with God that had deeply bothered him. And so he's in response to what God's response has been, and that's where we're going to find ourselves now. So depending on where you're at in your Bible, chapter 32, verse 7 is where we're going to find ourselves. Here's the conversation that goes on between God and Moses before he makes his way down. It's interesting what God will tell Moses here. Moses, your people, before it was his people, now God's like, you know what, I'm done. Your people, whom you brought from the land of Egypt, oh, Moses, didn't you send me? These are your people? You told me to leave with them? I mean, I don't want to do any of this anyway. Your people who you decided to bring from the land of Egypt have corrupted themselves. How quickly they have turned away from the way I commanded them to live. They have melted down gold and made a calf, and they have bowed down in sacrifice. Here's what they're saying. They're saying, these are your gods, O Israel, who brought you out of the land of Egypt. Then the Lord said, I have seen how stubborn and how rebellious these people are. How stiff-necked, we were talking about that last week. How stiff-necked these people are. Now leave me alone. Here's what we did not do last week. God says, now leave me alone, so my fierce anger can blaze against them, and I will destroy them. Then I will make you, Moses, into a great nation. These are important things in a couple of sentences that we need to pick up on as it unfolds. One of the most demonstrative truths that we should be ascertaining from this book, from the book of Exodus, is that God is more intense about our sinful attitudes and our sinful actions than we are, or than we would probably want to make them out to be. We like to have ourselves judged by our intentions, and everyone else judged by their actions, right? We want to see the stupid that we just did viewed in light of our intentions. We want everybody else to be judged based on what they do. And God is doing both. And he takes both intense. He sees both of them in very intense ways, no matter how soft of a view of sin that we would rather him have. The phrase there that we saw in chapter 32, verse 10, when God says, leave me alone so my fierce anger can blaze against the Israelites. He wants his fierce anger to blaze. You know what this word means? Or this phrase actually in Hebrew means this. So my nose can get hot against them. That's the one phrase I didn't expect today to hear from God. I want you to leave me alone because I'm headed down to the bottom of the mountain. Stay here. I'm going to go down so that my hot nose can blaze against them. I guess it's an ancient idiom for something we maybe would say, somebody got red in the face. Right? Moses, I am red, hot, mad. I've had it. This is the face that we don't want to see. But it's a faith that's true. It's a faith that's real. It's a part about God that we need to know. And this is one thing that we've been finding ourselves uncovering moment after moment after moment, when we're really seeing him as he fully is, not just, again, as I trying to scratch away at perceptions that we're trying to force upon God, which are kind of pictures of a person who is either gray-haired, or gray-haired, long beard, sits in a rocker, or a person like in our mind's eye, like Jesus, who strokes lambs and bounces little kids on his knee, and that's kind of the really softened version of God. Or is he in love with us? Is he gentle? Absolutely. But he is not that to the exception of these other things. He is a lot of things. And here he is confronting something intense, and he's saying, I've had it. You can only do this so many times, Moses, before you have to teach a lesson. Before you have to say enough is enough. I'm going to give you your way. That's how he is talking to Moses about the people. Billy Sunday, for those of you who are baseball fans or history buffs or whatever, you maybe know he was baseball great. Well, Billy Sunday, from the late 1800s to the early 1900s, was a famous preacher as well. In fact, I got a real huge privilege when I was in college. I got to actually preach at his tabernacle in Iowa. He formed a couple of those throughout the nation, and I got a chance to preach to this crowd of people. It was an amazing thing, and they have a certain kind of vibe. If you've ever been to a Billy Sunday tabernacle, what kind of people they're expecting, what kind of preaching they're expecting, because the kind of guy that he was one of those kind of hardcore, old school preachers that seem to be found more in the past than in the present. But even though he was hardcore, it did not mean that he failed to be received, or at least listened to, in his day. And here is something that he said about living against and preaching against sin. Now, you'd expect an old hardcore preacher to be preaching against sin all the time. Well, this is the kind of thing he said about living against sin and preaching against it. Amazing quote. He says, I'm against sin. I'll kick it as long as I got a foot. I'll fight it as long as I got a fist. I'll butt it as long as I've got a head. I'll bite it as long as I've got a tooth. When I'm old and fistless and footless and toothless, I'll gum it till I go home to glory and it goes home to perdition. That's how he saw sin. I'll gum it if I have to. I'm going to fight it in me. I'm going to fight it with others. It matters. That's old school, right? But is it? Is it really supposed to be old school, I guess, is the question. It's a humorous sermon line. It's kind of a strange contrast to probably the experience that we have more and more here in America. The larger way that sin is discussed or failed to be discussed, and the larger way in which we talk about sin in general. If there's anything, I would think, that preachers, Christians, radio folk, authors, the church, and certainly the wider non-Christian world in which we live, seemed to preach against nowadays, it actually seems to be preaching against anything. You get it? Don't say something harsh. Don't say something hard. Don't draw lines. Keep it ambiguous. End with a joke. End with everyone feeling good about themselves. That's how preaching, or just talking in general about the realities of what sin does in killing the planet, in the people who live upon it, and you and me. And so what ends up happening is this ambiguity about sin. God doesn't have any ambiguities about it, and he's telling Moses what he's getting ready to do, because he knows if he does not somehow draw a line, if he does not make it clear, they will just think that it's not that big of a deal. Those of you who are parents, you understand that. But in spite of what we maybe is happening more prevalently in our culture, God is tougher than we are on sin. He is responsive to our ways. He sees, and what we do matters to him deeply. And so he's responsive to that in a way that is fully fair and just. He just said, it was fresh in their minds. It was less than a month before this. It was fresh in their minds, the kind of things that you're not supposed to do. So it was fair, it was just. God is responsive. But in being so, being responsive to our ways, when it means punishment, he is also much more responsively forgiving than we reflexively are. He has a tenderness and a mercy that few, if any of us, could draw out. Certainly not to the degree that he can. He can exponentially draw it out more than we can, but even when we think our anger is righteous, when it's well placed, when it's just, he can draw mercy and forgiveness from those things in those moments perfectly. God is red-nosed hot, but he is listening. Look what happens next in verse 11. But Moses tried to pacify the Lord as God. It's an interesting word. I don't have time to bring it out today, but I'd like to talk to you about it if I could. Moses tried to pacify the Lord as God. Oh Lord, why are you so angry with your own people? He reminds God. Not in a disrespectful way. They're not my people, they're your own people, whom you brought from the land of Egypt with such great power and such a strong hand. Why let the Egyptians say? There is a line of logic that he is going to use with God here, and a couple things he's going to do that are going to be amazing. Why let the Egyptians say their God rescued them with the evil intention of slaughtering them in the mountains and wiping them from the face of the earth? It doesn't make sense, God. You saved them in such a huge way, and then you kill them. Where's there any glory, power, or redemptive work in that? That's what he says. And then he says these words, and hold on to them. Turn away from your fierce anger, God. Turn away from your fierce anger. Change your mind about this terrible disaster that you have threatened against your people. Turn away. Remember your servants Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. Those of us who have been a part of this whole experience from Genesis through to where we're at today can really appreciate what he's saying. There's a promise and a covenant that you've been doing long, long before now. It's not just about these people. It's also about what you've been promising for centuries. There will be a promise fulfilled. And it has to do with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. You bound yourself with an oath to them, saying, I will make your descendants as numerous as the stars of heaven, and I will give them all this land that I have promised to your descendants, and they will possess it forever. He says, remember your promise, God. This is what he said. So in verse 14, it points out simply, the Lord changed his mind about the terrible disaster he had threatened to bring on his people. This is an intense look into the activity of God among the affairs of people like you and me. It's a very intense look. And it can only mean one thing, that God is truly responsive not only to our wrong actions, but also to our right prayers. He is not trying to reflexively, or I should say, not simply just reflexively lunging himself at our wrongs. He is reflexively lunging himself at our prayers. He will listen and he will do something about the things that we are praying, which I think is massive. It changes for me if I view the descriptions given to him in the Torah. Certainly, this is one of many examples in the scriptures. It gives me a whole other view of God, but also a whole other view of prayer. Another view of prayer would be, okay, if I pray, God's going to do whatever he's going to do anyway. And so that would mean prayer is not really a request anymore, is it? It would be this, simply, God, please give me, assuage my worries about whatever's going to happen no matter what I would pray anyway. Help me just to deal with it, whatever you're going to do, good or bad. That's kind of, numb me, Lord, numb me to the pain of what's ready to happen. That's an option, which I don't think is being described here. And the option that I do think is being said, which is, God, you're God. You've made promises. Yes, these people are bad. So am I. You've been doing a lot of work with me. I'm glad you did not destroy me. Please do something different. And God listens and he responds. This is an amazing story, but it's an amazing larger truth. When I say I pray, God believes in prayer. Listen to the version of this same story told by the psalmist. You can turn there, you can just listen, you can see it on the screen, either one. It's in Psalms 106. Verse 19 says, this is how the psalmist describes the situation. He says, the people made a calf at Mount Sinai. They bowed before an image made of gold. They traded their glorious God for a statue of grass-eating bull. That's interesting. I don't think they meant that in Hebrew, but it makes a lot of sense in English, doesn't it? They traded for a lot of bull. They forgot God, their Savior, who had done such great things in Egypt, such wonderful things in the land of Ham, such awesome deeds at the Red Sea. So he declared he would destroy them. But Moses, his chosen one, stepped between the Lord and his people. He begged him to turn from his anger. There's that word again. There's more rooting in the ancient language that it comes from. He stepped between God and the people, and he begged God to turn from his anger and to not destroy him. There are about 1,000 things to take up in this story, all of which are both alarming and exciting at the exact same time. But there's two that stand large, and this particular version of the story in Psalms help highlight a little bit of that as well. I had mentioned that I brought focus to seeing those words turn or turn away in these two variations of the story. And that word turn explains volumes of what Moses is praying that God would do. The word is shuv, and it's a word that gets used occasionally in the five books of the Torah. So Moses is familiar with what this word means. And the heart of the idea in shuv is to return. Return. Moses kept asking God to return. Earlier in the book of Genesis, if you remember the story where God comes to Abraham and Sarah and he says, I know you're old, it's impossible for you to have babies. I'm going to come back here a year from now, I'm going to return to you, and there's going to be a miracle that's going to happen. You're going to have a baby at the age of 100. And they laugh. He says, I'm going to come back. I'm going to come back and do something. This whole idea of return. Come back to your people. Come back to me. Come back to your people. Shuv is the word that's going on in this word. Yes, there's no doubt, God, they're wrong. But they're your people. The ramifications are too large, God, for you to walk away, for you to go down that mountain and do what you should do and what you could do, but please don't. Be God. You have a testimony, God, that is unquestionably powerful, but Lord, across the globe it is being seen that is unquestionably good. Please return. Return to your people. Let me yell at them. This is what will happen. Let me go down there and yell at them, but please don't give up on them. Return to your people in the direction that you were going. And the scriptures teaches us that Yahweh responded to the prayer. It was going to go this way, but then it went that way. Does that enliven your sense of prayer? I hope it does. There was something so simple and something so true in Moses' prayer. It revealed to God a heart of deep, deep love. How do you see this kind of love? It's very simple. As we finish, I want you to appreciate what prayer Moses is willing to pray, not just by word, but in deed. We see it in that obscure phrase back in Psalm 106, which says that Moses stepped between the Lord and his people. He stepped between them. It's the word peretz. It means Moses stood in the breach. The Hebrew makes more sense to me than the English does. We don't use the term stepped in the breach often. Maybe an old military term, maybe we'd see it in that kind of a way. It's a phrase we don't commonly use in English, to step into the breach. To stand in a breach means we place ourselves in the middle of a huge burst, a blast, a destruction. Israel's sin, here's the word picture, Israel's sin had blown a huge hole in the wall of their relationship with God. And God was going to come through that blown up hole, and he was going to do some of his work. There was a breach in the wall, a breach in the relationship, and Israel had caused it. Now God was going to finish it. He was going to come through that hole in the wall. That burst, that brokenness is the breach. Moses placed himself in that spot. It changes how I think about praying about other people, other people's situations. God, please help them. If you don't, that's up between you and them. It's different thing to pray about people and their situations at a great distance. It's an entirely different thing to pray this way. To not only pray, God, please don't bring your wrath upon your people, but if you do, me too. To take all of that upon himself as well. That reminds me of a person that we'll see about 1,400 years later in the name of Jesus Christ. Take it upon me. I know there's justice that has to be done here, God, but please, I'm going to stand here in the gap. I'm going to stand in the breach. He had a prayer that purely asked God to show mercy, but he backed it up by willing to stand in the breach, to get hit himself, to stand in the gap for the people of the Lord. He got into the middle of it. That's a different kind of praying, right? It's a different kind of praying in that it's not just at a distance. It gets messy. And it's also an entreating of God that is impassioned and pure. Moses was fully committed both to the Lord as well as to his people. And in light of this, the strange thing was that God was not threatening him at all, was he? if you paid attention as the story unfolded, he wasn't threatening Moses at all, just the fools at the bottom of the mountain. He's like, Moses, I'm going to make a nation out of you and your family. I'll start fresh with you. I want you to think about that. Moses stood to simplify life. Think about that. Because have the people of Israel been the best to Moses? Are they always, casting compliments and praise and glory for Moses? Not so much. Moses has got a lot of naysayers. He could stand to just simplify life, but from being in the gap to be like, a lot of people would kind of say a lot of mean things about me and my family. I guess God is just. He'd have had a whole nation named after him. It wouldn't have been the nation of Israel anymore. It would have been the nation of Moses. He stood to gain a lot from that justice. But what does he do? He stands in the gap. He stands in the breach. He says, God, please, no. Be God. Which made his prayer so incredibly simple, so incredibly earnest, so incredibly pure. And that's the kind of prayer that God can respond to. As we finish, I'd like to share with you a story because I've not been a person with profound prayer or profound faith. In fact, I probably was a better prayer as a child than I ever have been as an adult or as a pastor. It's my sin to confess. Probably don't gather up the faith that I need, or certainly the faithfulness in praying that I would need to be a man of prayer and a man of faith. The point is that when I was like 6 or 7 years old, we had to make a couple of trips back and forth from Missouri to actually right here, where my mom and dad had got married here, became a Christian, a Christ follower, got called into ministry here in this area, and since they're called to go to school and pursue that. And so over the course of like 2 or 3 years, we were kind of back and forth from that school when we lived down there and we lived here. And so one of those trips, we had packed up the truck and we're making our way one way or the other. I'm not sure which way. If we were coming back here, we were going down there. So I was younger. We were coming up here. Okay, we're coming up here. So at this point, I'm just, I'm 6, 7, 8 years old. Got an old